Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you guys very much for joining us today. I hope everyone is doing healthy, fantastic, and well. We've got a really great presentation today from Etienne Cortel, Director of Scientific Outreach and Education here at L-Acoustics. Etienne, how are things? I believe technically you are just not in Paris. Is that correct? You are millimeters away from the city? And you are muted, Etienne. Just so you know, we have a beer policy at this podcast.
Exactly. So yeah, hello everybody. Yeah, technically I'm like 30 meters away from Malakoff, from Paris, and living in Malakoff. And it looks like the sun is just opening right now, so it will hit my face, and that will be a beautiful evening.
Excellent.
Happy
And
to be there with us.
Etienne, we're joined with Francois. Francois, how are you doing today? Oh man, we got 2 beers coming to everybody in the webinar here today. Francois, we got to unmute your mic one time. And
yeah. Sorry, you know, I'm a bit tired. The week has been long, but I'm here. I'm here with you, and happy to be here.
Excellent. Thank you, Francois. So Etienne and Francois are going to present today measurement, quality, and representativity. So this presentation is actually taking from 3 white papers that we've written here at L-Acoustics that Francois and Etienne have been extensively involved in, all about where and how to get good measurements. This is some really, really interesting information that can help you guys do even better system calibrations and tunings going forward. To help answer questions as we're doing this presentation, we've brought along one of the most expert panel of moderators we've had yet on a webinar. We're going to start with my friend in Germany, Tommy. How is everything in Germany?
It's good here in Germany, and the sun is shining in Berlin, and I was able to unmute my microphone before talking. It's the old rental and tuning thing. First press, first push, then talk, right?
Yeah, that's great.
Impressive to me, impressive.
Yeah, he's a multitasker and a German, so this is good.
Hallo liebe Freunde da draußen an den Bildschirmen. Wir freuen uns natürlich, dass ihr wieder dabei seid und hoffen, dass ihr schön aufpasst. Sicherlich heute ein bisschen wissenschaftlicher und nicht ganz so viele praktische Beispiele, dafür aber sehr, sehr interessant in jedem Fall. So, thanks for watching.
Thank you, Tommy. Samuel, joining us for the first time on a webinar. How are you doing, sir?
Hi guys. Yeah, really excited about all this. So yeah, as you mentioned, it's the first time for me. So just to, yeah, I'm a research engineer, and I've been involved basically in some of the research work that Etienne and Francois will present today. So I'll try to answer to your questions, guys, as a moderator today, and I'll do that in English and in French. So n'hésitez pas si vous avez des questions en français, j'essaierai d'y répondre. Yeah, enjoy, guys.
Thank you. Sergey in London, I feel like I've been to your apartment now many times. It's good to see the brick wall. How's everything in London, Sergey?
Everything is good. Sun is shining currently, a bit cloudy, but sun is shining. Thanks everyone for joining again. It feels like we get to know each other already. Thank you for your good questions, and it's sometimes tricky to answer them because the answer requires something like 1 hour. So we will answer them sometimes in a generic way, but hopefully you will get some of the answers in more detail during the presentations. And if you're still not satisfied, come to our trainings and we'll have a chance to talk in person and discuss your particular projects. Привет всем, кто понимает русский, можете и на русском спрашивать, или можете просто написать привет. Наслаждайтесь.
Excellent. Thank you, Sergey. Alex in Guadalajara. Alex, it's good to see you as well. How are you doing today?
Well, we have clear sky, sunny, warm. So it's a beautiful day here in Guadalajara. So it's a beautiful day for such an interesting webinar we're having today with this great panel. I hope you guys enjoy it, and welcome everybody. A todos los hispanohablantes que nos acompañan una vez más. Hoy vamos a hablar de un tema muy interesante que seguramente va a traer muchísimas preguntas, así que por favor siéntanse cómodos de hacerlas en español. Haremos todo lo posible por responderlas a la brevedad, y bueno, sean todos bienvenidos, lo disfruten. Thank you guys, thank you Scott.
Thank you, Alex. Etienne, I think it's time to hand it over for you to start presenting measurement quality and representativity. It's probably the coolest word I've gotten to say all week. Etienne, all yours.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. Thanks, everybody, and welcome to our presentation. So let's put a little bit of context. As you know, it's the end of our M1 week, so obviously, you should be quite proficient now about the M1 software, but we wanted to put a bit of perspective and saying, like, with this tool, we have the ability to acquire, let's say, a lot of data in a very easy and convenient way. And this is going to drive one particular aspect of a loudspeaker system project, which is on-site tuning. So the thing with on-site tuning is that often we have been defining at a design step a solution which has been defined in free field condition, typically in our sound vision software. And that allows already quite a lot of optimization. So you've seen all of that with my colleagues, a lot of optimization on the sources themselves. So with our new auto-splay and auto-filter algorithms, there are always plenty of possibilities for time alignment, especially for field systems, again, main systems. But still, when we come on site in a venue, there will be some additional optimization that we will want to carry in order to address unplanned settings, some things we couldn't show, we couldn't see during the design. The varying atmospheric conditions, and indoors it's going to be relatively mild, but outdoors it can be quite severe, the changes. And some aspects, obviously, about room acoustics, because when we move from field situation to an actual space, you will have boundaries and you will have an interaction of a loudspeaker system with these boundaries, and this will affect the sound of the system within the audience. And typically, the task that we will want to do at that time, at that step of tuning, will be to EQ the system and align typically the subs with the main. At least we'll concentrate on that in this presentation based on acoustical measurements. So obviously, when we are talking about acoustical measurements, we want to make sure that the measurements that we have been acquiring are leading us into good decisions. And that means, like, we will capture probably a few measurements that will drive the entire tuning process, EQ, sub-alignment, and we need to make sure that what we are capturing, what we are deciding, works not only at one spot where we've done maybe one measurement, but for the entire audience of tens or hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of people. So there will be obviously two topics we want to address. Is my set of measurement representative of what's going to happen in the audience? And for that, we have two topics which are closely linked. Is how many measurements do I need to capture? And where should I place the microphones? And that will be the part one, where we will talk about how to define the measurement locations. You could have only one that you're moving from one location to the next, but we have a powerful way of acquiring in a very efficient way measurements for a silent tuning later on. So we can afford to use more locations maybe that was done in the past. And then the second topic will be, once we've defined those measurement locations, is how to get a measurement that's accurately describing how the system performs in the environment. And for that, we'll need to account for atmospheric conditions, instabilities, especially at high frequencies, and the influence of background noise when we want to capture those measurements at low frequencies. And this is something we will address in a second part, where we'll see how we can optimize for high measurement quality using the sweep settings in M1. And that means the number of sweeps we're going to acquire for each measurement, the duration of this sweep, and the overall level of this sweep. So first thing, we'll want to, in this first part, like define measurement locations in our space. And for that, like as I said, we'll focus on two particular tasks. The first one will be the one of aligning the subsystem towards the main system. And the second one will be the equalization. So which set of measurements do we need to capture in order to have a representative response of the system in order to perform that equalization. So for the sub-alignment, I will give the word to Francois, who will take over and guide you through that task.
Yeah. So so I'm going to take over for this part. So just to tell you that this is again kind of a teasing of our loudspeaker system calibration training. And then we'll dig a bit more into the I would say the scientific background behind all our recommendation, and we have for this 3 white papers that you're going to have access to using the link which is provided in the Q&A, and you'll find them on our website as well. So let's talk about sub-main alignment. So we're interested in finding the right location, but first, right location for alignment. But first, let's talk a bit about the issue itself. So we want to optimize the summation of a main with a sub. They are showing quite a, let's say, limited frequency range, but they are showing a large coverage area. The fact is that they are not exactly at the same place. Sometimes they are quite separated in space, and this separation led to time arrival differences, meaning that we are in a situation where we have comb filtering. So this is typically a time domain problem. This is not a purely magnitude problem. This is not something that we can address through equalization. We need to use a delay for that, and we can apply it. We'll see depending on the situation on the main or on the subwoofer system. So what the situation when we have the two elements at exactly the same location? So that's something that does not really happen in the real life, but we have what we call the pre-alignment delay to address this, I would say, initial situation. This is because these are two different, I would say, technological objects. So, for example, different enclosure dimension, different vents, maybe the filters are a bit different. So even though we try to optimize the presets so that they have the best compatibility, we still have a bit of I would say, phase response differences that we are going to address through this pre-alignment delay. So that exactly the same as when we try to align component within a multi-way loudspeaker system, just that now we have two separated elements that are building our reference response, and we do not include the pre-alignment delay in the preset. It's up to the user to add it, because there are many different combinations that we can think about. So we give all this pre-alignment delay in our preset guide at L-Acoustics, but that, I would say, a starting point to make the two elements compatible in phase if they were at the same location. But now, in the real life, this is how our systems are going to be implemented. So we have something which is what we call a coupled configuration. So you'll see it's the two objects are quite close in space. They are not exactly at the same spot, but acoustically speaking, we call it coupled. And then you have all the other configuration, all the other deployment where we have a separated system. So one, I would say, quite popular one is a vertically separated system with ground stacked sub and flown array. But you can think about other one like the arc sub on the ground and the flown array. And this situation, you have for example, the separation in both dimension, horizontally and vertically. So we're going to focus mainly on these three situations today. So we have this pre-alignment delay, but in real life, even in a couple situation, we have a bit of physical separation. So, and when it's purely separated, then you have even more physical separation, even more variation in terms of arrival time over the audience. So the question is that, is the pre-alignment delay enough or not? Enough for the couple situation? Maybe, we'll see. But we need to think about a delay to compensate the geometric separation. As the arrival time differences are going to be different from one spot in the audience to another, we cannot find, I would say, a delay that is going to give the best summation for all the audience. So we really need to find what we call a compromise. We are going to look for a location that is going to give us the delay for the best spatial homogeneity. So how are we going to do that? That might be maybe a tricky slide to present, but this is a really important one. So the idea is that we're going to try to optimize the audience so that there is I would say, the best compromise, but focus on the shared frequency range. As you can see, we have a limited frequency range, which is around the crossover point, but not only. The combination is not to be considered only at one frequency, but over the shared frequency range. And for this, this is what leads us to this, I would say, criteria, which is that we say we want that maximum of the shared coverage area is within plus or minus 90 degrees of phase shift. So why is that? If you see this quite a complex graph, which shows, I would say, the summation between two signals, depending on the relative phase offset, but also depending on the relative level difference. So I would say one situation which is well known is when the signals are at equal level, so 0 dB, that's the black line here. And then we know that when there is no phase offset, this is a maximum summation with equal level, and we have plus 6 dB. And now when this is totally out of phase, so 180 degree of phase shift, that's the perfect cancellation. So that's theoretically a minus infinite. So that's, I think, some well-known value. But as you can see, we need to consider much more than that. But because at the, I would say, the higher overlap frequency between the two systems, even though they are not at the same level, they are still combining, and we can still have, I would say, a beneficial or detrimental summation, even though there is as much as 10 dB of difference. That's why we really need to consider the differential, and if we consider the level differential, we need to consider that we restrict our window to this plus or minus 90 degree of phase shift, so that we are sure that we have a summation which is at least positive everywhere. So that's a bit complex to summarize in that a short time, but if we think about our, I would say, crossover point of 60 Hertz for our standard preset, then what does it mean? It means that our upper overlap frequency is going to be around 100 Hertz. So at 100 Hertz, you're going to have maybe about 10 dB of differential between the system, but this is, I would say, we need to consider this frequency, because if we can fit the timing at this frequency, it can only be better lower in frequency. So what about 100 Hertz? We see that plus or minus 90 degree for this corresponds to plus or minus 2.5 milliseconds, meaning that we need to bring the arrival time differences within the audience within this window. So now we have a starting point. We have a starting point with different systems, that can be yeah, thank you. So we have a starting point in the audience. The idea is to find a point where you're going to distribute this window, so that maybe at the end of the venue, the main system is going to be late by 2.5 milliseconds, according to the sub, and at the front of the audience, and now the system is going to lead by 2.5 milliseconds. So all is about again distributing this window within the audience to have most of the audience within a right summation area. When we look at a couple situation, that's quite easy actually. You see that in this situation, that's a flown B-side situation. So the main and the sub just flown B-side, and you can see the mapping of the time difference just in this window, and we see that all is within 5 milliseconds. So I'm not going to show you all the simulation, but in a kind of a standard audience area like this, most of the audience or all the audience is within 5 milliseconds. So we have really no problem to find a right alignment position. At the end, any location would do the trick. And you could even use the pre-alignment delay from as a plug and play value. Even without any measurement, you're going to be fine. Yes, you better to optimize on site to move the summation, the best summation where you want it to be, maybe at the FOH, but all in all, you're going to be fine. Now, if we think about separated system, it's a bit different. So there is, what we are showing here is two different situations. So I would say small venue with a system which is flown but not that high, and a large venue with a system which is flown a bit higher. So what we can see is that when the system is low, like in a club, again, you're going to be fine. We see that all the audience is within 5 milliseconds. But as soon as you're going to raise the system in the air, you're going to, I would say, to increase the time arrival difference at the front of the audience. And it can be, I would say, quite fast, quite quick it's really located at the front, but the value can grow very big. You see that in the graph on the right, you have more than 10 milliseconds just in front of the main array. So there is a real question of probably the best alignment location. So what would be our recommendation? That's again not an absolute answer. All is about compromises. You know, we are in the acoustic world. Not too close, but not too far. So that's our recommendation. Why I'm telling you that? We are looking at the graph again on the right. Now, what we are showing here is a mapping representing the percentage of the audience that is going to be within our best summation window, depending on the alignment location. So just imagine you put your mic on this 95 line. It means that 95% of the audience is going to be within our window. And as you can see, when you are at the front, we are into the blue colors, meaning that if you would like to align your system in front of the array, you're going to end up with less than 20% of the audience within our summation window. So that's what we are seeing. So this is really important to avoid to be too close, but at the end, once you are at a certain distance, enough far away, I would say, you have still quite a large area where you can find a good summation, I would say, location. Now, when we say not too far, this is because at one point, you're going to go over the optimal location and you're going to start to lose a bit of the audience within our summation window. So yes, there is an optimal summation point within this audience. That's probably for this audience around the third of the audience. But again, this is it depends on the height of the array and on the depth of the audience itself. Now, let's talk a bit about the ArcSub, the great love of our friend Scott Sugden. In any room size, we can see that most of the audience is going to be over 5 milliseconds. So meaning that the range of arrival time difference is quite large, and meaning that that's the million dollar question: where to align? I don't know.
That's the problem,
you know?
Francois, right? The ArcSub is an amazing thing for consistency of coverage, but you have to trade off the ability to align it with a stereo PA. So it's always my challenge in life of how to find the best place to align it. So is there a best place to align an ArcSub when you have a stereo PA? That's my $1 million question for you.
That's the next slide. I don't have a real answer, actually. So the least bad recommendation would be maybe between main on axis and the room center, or at the FOH position, maybe. But if you look at the mapping now, the same mapping about the percentage of the audience which would be aligned depending on the alignment position, we are in the blue area. So it means that at maximum, maybe we can expect 20% of the audience to be aligned. So I don't know. In a way, it's if we think about spatial homogeneity, that's good in a way that this is not aligned anywhere. So this is a kind of homogenization.
Yeah, if it's equally bad everywhere, it's just bad everywhere. So
exactly,
everyone's consistently bad. I guess that's a win for the ArcSub. And that is the challenge in life. Is you might have good spectral information, i.e. the frequency response, but you're going to have terrible time. And music is so much about time that it really poses a challenge. And I guess you're only showing this math with a fairly small size system. I would assume it gets worse as we get bigger and bigger, doesn't it?
Yeah, sure. Again, higher is the main system. Narrower is going to be this window, and again, the best window is at maximum 20%. So that's a real challenge. So now we talk about the best alignment location. So to know more, please come to our training. But that was already quite the essence of it, and just explaining all the challenges and the compromises that we need to make when choosing an alignment location. But now, even though we have a good alignment location, we need to be sure that we have good quality of the data. We are talking about acoustic measurement today. So we have other way to align a sub and a main system, but if we focus on this, one first thing is maybe we should talk about the direct to reverberant ratio, meaning that there is one point in space, I would say in the depths of the audience, where the diffuse sound, so the sound from all the reflection, the reverberation sound, is going to be as high in level as the direct sound, and quickly you're going to end up with more reverberation information within your measurement than direct sound. But what we want to align is the direct sound of the sub. So the idea is to avoid this situation. And this would lead us to think that we need to have the mic location as close as possible so that we minimize this reverberant field. But then just think about what we were just telling you about the best alignment location. Close location, you have a high risk of bad spatial homogeneity, especially with separated systems. So that's a conflict. Now it's not too far, but not too close. So that's the other way around, but about the same takeaway. What else? What can we say about measurement quality? Yes, we can talk about the floor notch in the data. So ideally, we would like to avoid the floor notch to be in our measurement data within the main sub crossover range, but they're using mic understand, which is, I would say, probably the most popular approach and a very valid one. We have a risk to get the first notch, the first frequency, right into our crossover range. So how can we avoid this? The idea is to be able to move the first notch out of the crossover range. And now we are talking about 200 Hertz because the first notch is 1 octave wide, meaning that it's going to affect down to 100 Hertz, which is our upper overlap frequency for our main sub combination. So if we look at this, actually we have a graph showing that we have the frequency of the first notch depend on the height of the system and depend as well on the distance to the source. With a system which is quite low, again, quickly, like for example, we have a system which is trim height of 4 meters. After 10 meters in the depth of the audience, then you show that you already moved your first notch out of the crossover range. But with a system which is flown much higher, like 10 meters, for example, you see that now you need to go at least above 25 meters to be sure that you move this first notch out of your measurement. So again, further you are, I would say, more secure you are to avoid this data pollution from the first notch. But again, if you are far away, it means that you are probably beyond the critical distance. So that's another conflict, not too close, but not too far. So that's not an easy world we are living in, huh, Scott?
No, I've always gone back and forth whether the floor position is valid or good or not. To me, I don't listen to the show on the floor, so it always pollutes. Like if I use that floor mic as anything other than maybe an alignment tool, just for my mains and my subs. But I've also run into some logistical problems, which are I've lost several microphones over the years to a mic on the floor and being run over by a forklift. So is it worth a $500 or $1,000 calibration mic every time to get a slightly better alignment? The other thing too is I usually don't align my subs in the first 10 or 20 meters because in a big festival where the PA is high or a big arena show where the PA is high, I don't want the optimal alignment to be in the front. There's already too much low frequency in front. So it tends to not be the point at which I'm picking. I'm usually up near front of house, which is 35, 40, 45 meters away with a PA flown at that kind of height. So for me, it's not usually worth it. Plus, I've gotten frustrated at losing microphones, so I've given up on that for the most part. Occasionally, I'll do it if I'm having a really hard time getting an alignment scenario, but it's usually just one position just to check.
Yeah, but true that this is still a valid approach. So for some people, sometimes they even do some position on the ground, some position on the stand. So it's a valid approach because yes, putting the mic on the ground, you avoid this floor notch, but not always. So that's you need to be careful that this is only, I would say, perfect when it's on flat audience area. As soon as you have balconies, then you still have the floor reflection into the measurement, and depending on the slope of the tribunes as well, you may have the floor reflection even though the mic is on the ground. So be careful. That's not that perfect. Also, never forget that we are talking about many limitations from the measurement. Never forget that you still have the geometric measurement. If you are in a situation where really you cannot ensure the quality of the measurement, maybe just measuring the geometric difference with a laser meter and then calculating the corresponding delay time can give you better result than a bad acoustical measurement. So second part, equalization. So equalization, what's the principle here? What's the issue? We want to optimize the frequency response using EQ point. And now what we are interested in is still addressing the spatial homogeneity, meaning that we don't want that we put one acupoint at one location that is going to be detrimental to another position. So we need to be sure that we're going to act on representative data that are representative of the audience. What if we would use only one location? The problem is that many deviations present variability over space, mostly the one from room reflections. So with a one single curve, you're not going to be able to see if it's something which is only a local irregularity or not. And the other way around, some other deviations are really stable in space. And this one, you maybe want to correct them. But again, if you have only one curve, how could you know that this is stable over space? So I think it's quite obvious that we need multiple locations to properly address equalization. We're going to use a combination for the interpretation, a combination of individual curves and average. So with the individual curves, we'll be able to identify what's variable, so all what's variable and what's stable. And then if we only look at the average, that's a good way, I would say, to have a, I would say, a safe EQ decision. If you have the right number and position of measurement location, you're going to have a representative average, which is going to smooth all the spatial variability within the magnitude response. So this is really a combination of looking at the individual curves and the average that is going to give you the best results. Now, how to collect this representative data? So we're going to address different topics today. So again, we're going to talk a bit more about the mic on stand versus the mic on the ground. And then we're going to tackle which area we want to measure, and then the layout of location and the number of location. So stay tuned. I think that's going to be quite interesting for all of us. First, so mic on stand. So now we are not talking about only alignment anymore, but EQ. So as Scott was telling us earlier, at least with the mic on stand, you have a representative LF contour buildup. So in a festival maybe, but most of the time we are not going to listen to a system lying on the ground. So we need to address this listener height because this is what is going to bring this LF buildup. Actually, so we have the simulation here and some measurement, but we can see in the graph, the upper graph, we can see the difference between an empty room at on the ground, so that's the blue curve, and an occupied room, and an empty room, but now at 1.2 meter. This is the red curve. So as you can see, when you put the mic on the ground, this is not that you don't have the LF buildup, but this is that you have the edge shaft buildup as well. So it's as if you cannot see the LF buildup from the listener height. But maybe you already spotted it. What's interesting also in this graph is this. So that's the black curve actually, which is now the same measurement. So on stand 1.2 meter, but now an occupied room with the audience filling the room. And now what you can see here is that the floor notch is moving in frequency. So that's quite obvious in this representation. And also this little bump just after the first notch on the red curve that maybe we would have liked to correct with an EQ at the tuning time, it totally disappeared with the audience. So there is I would say quite a large frequency range where we need to be careful with the tuning decisions that we take within an empty space, an empty room in general, because it may drastically change once the audience fill the space. Actually, we have this was from simulation on the upper graph, but the lower graph is actual measurement that was from last summer in France, and it totally confirms the simulation. We have a shift of the first notch from the floor reflection. So really be careful. That's why maybe you don't know about it, but maybe that's why after the sound check you have one EQ that is going to be necessary to listen to the system with a mixing engineer. But once the audience comes in a room, you need to release some of this EQ to recover some of the low or low mid response.
Well, this makes perfect sense, because almost every show you get started and it just feels like it's lost something that you had at soundcheck or vice versa. And it's always in that low mid range between 100 and 500 hertz, right? This is the thing that drastically changes when the room fills up, and this is showing that, right? If we, and especially if we did our calibration with a mic on the floor and we use that for anything other than alignment of main to sub, the low end just got a lot bigger when the audience filled up, because we don't have that reflection in our measurement. And in fact, that's not what we heard even during sound check, right? So it's not going to give us that direction. I find it so interesting though how much that shift was in that simulation and how much that shift was in the measurement in the real world, and it completely validates everything I've heard at shows for the last 20 years, is that change in the low mid, or the low, if you will. So it's really cool to see. Thank you, Francois.
Most welcome. Yeah, so what about the mic underground? So again, that's a valid approach. The floor reflection is masked at least on a flat audience area outdoor. You minimize the risk of EQ mistake due to this, but again, it's not the perfect solution. Once you are indoor, you have all the other reflection anyway that are going to be into the data. So that's again, one measurement is not going to be enough to represent all these room reflection irregularities. And the floor LF contour buildup is masked. So maybe that's fine. Maybe you know how to read the curve, and you know that you would say mentally you need to add this floor buildup into your process. But just that's something that you should know. Also, it's not always that practical because of some specific spot where you're going to have HF shadowing. But still, that's a valid approach. Now, measurement area. So measurement area. So first thing is you need to measure within the coverage of the source. Okay, quite simple, this one. But now, if we want to be a bit more precise, we're going to say that we're going to avoid to be too close to any wall. When you are close to a wall, you have this kind of energetic reflection, which is really localized. You have a huge variation in the frequency of the first notch. So that's not something which is representative of the whole audience. When we think about I would say the area close to the front wall, so the front wall would be the wall behind the array in this representation. So again, we want to avoid to be too close to the reflection of the front wall, but also we want to avoid an area where in some design of large line sources, you end up with sometimes low mid notches. So this should be addressed through design, but in some situation when we need to cover and there is no other situation, we end up by having maybe too many elements, a bit too curved at the bottom, and we end up with this notch in the low mid. And many people they miss this notch. And I think it's a reflection from the floor typically, but this is not. This is something which is within the direct field of a line source, and even more complex than that, which is due to the near field of a line source. So this is not something that you can address with standard EQ. So better not showing this within the measurement if you want to properly interpret your data. Now, when you are when you are further away, so again, avoid to be too close to the back wall because you have a strong reflection close to the back wall, but also, again, there is this idea of avoiding the reverberant field. So all in all, this is about readability of the data. So yes, if you would have thousands of microphones and you could map the wall space with microphone, you would get a better representativity of the audience if you put them all over the space. But as soon as you have a limited number of microphones, sorry, let's say 8, just imagine you have half of this microphone in this outlier zones. This is how we call it in statistics. Then these microphones are going to corrupt the data. They are going to lead to wrong interpretation. So all is about balancing the readability of the data to be able to interpret the data against representativity. I think I'm done with this part. And now I'm going to hand the mic to my friend Etienne. Etienne?
Hi. Yeah, I'm back with mic on this time. No second beer. Okay, so now we are going to talk about, now that we've established the area that we want to measure, in which we want to place the microphones, we'll be looking into how these microphones should be spread and why we would want to do so and how many locations do we want to use. So the first layout, which is quite common practice, would be to spread them in depth, which is common practice because it gives like a representative tonal balance average. So where you will be able to assess how much HF over low frequency we can have over the distance. So have a good representation. It's also a usual practice, I think, that was established also before we had autofilter, and it was a way to be able also to work on differential EQ along the array. Now that we have autofilter, and I think more and more users recognize that it's fairly efficient, it does the job, so we don't really need to do that, but we can really address the source as a whole. So that's a valid approach. That still that works, but we'll see there are some possible drawbacks, and we'll address them later. So that's why we're also proposing and considering 2 alternative solutions, which would also introduce some spread in widths. So where we'll cover a little bit more of the coverage of the source, and a little bit be able to account for off-axis variation. So we take a great care of having a very smooth polar pattern. So it will be, but still there are in some a specific layout, it's good to be able to check and slightly adjust. And that's also a way to be able, as we'll see, to minimize the impact of certain reflections we would want to avoid. For that, we have 2 layouts that we are proposing. So one which we call intersect line, which is basically 2 lines, one on axis, one slightly off axis, that would typically comprise the front of house position. And the zebra, which is actually not so much randomized in terms of location, but a kind of regular spread along both dimensions, so depth and width of the spread of those microphones. So why the line could be a little bit problematic? What we've seen actually is that if we look only at the sidewall reflection, we have several graphs here, but let me show you first this one. This graph is showing you where is the first notch frequency caused by a sidewall reflection for such a room. What we can see is that all our microphones are pretty much within the same frequency region and will capture very strongly this frequency region as being a notch. Whereas if we look at the variability of this first notch frequency, it's actually quite big over the coverage area. And that's why we recognize in this second graph, more in the center, is that if we were able to capture the entire coverage with thousands of microphones, we would observe a target average curve, which would look like the black curve, where we have mostly like a flat response and a very small buildup at very low frequencies. And we would have, that's what is represented here in dotted lines, like a high variation of that frequency response. So if we were able to display all these measurements and analyze them, we would see that they vary quite a bit, and we would not be tempted to actually perform any correction there. However, when we look at the average of this multi-location measurement, so already these 8 positions, it was not like that small number, but along these 8 positions, like we see, we have quite a common pattern for this first notch. So we have quite a dip here and a bump here associated with not so much variability. So we might be tempted to apply an EQ, which would be detrimental to the overall sound quality. So what we want to say is that for indoor venues in general, it's quite, let's say, recommended not to go for an equal distance of the microphones towards the sidewall. And it's better to distribute them over the width as well. So that's what we see in those 2 possible layouts, is that we want, like in intersect lines and in zebra, to have a spread in both depth and width dimension. And you could have some level of randomization, mostly accounting for the fact that you don't really need to be very precise in the locations. So it's good to spread in both dimensions, and we don't want to have twice the same X and Y coordinates along the line. How many measurements once we've chosen that type of layout? Actually, the number of measurements is what we found is that considering the measurement area that we want to cover, considering the layouts that would allow us to have a good like spread in width and in depth, 8 measurements locations seems to be quite a sweet spot. So for that, like we did, like if we would use more locations, we would have a small benefit. And it's good to keep this number in mind because that's something that works pretty well. And for that, we have made an analysis with what we call the risk factor, which would be basically the risk of taking a wrong EQ decision that we'll look into details right after this graph. But you can see here for different type of reflection, so the floor reflection, the ceiling reflection, and the sidewall reflection, we have kind of a sweet spot where this risk factor is quite well diminished, around 8 locations. How did we establish that? And there we'll dig a little deeper into this analysis. In order to do so, we have used kind of a worst case scenario where we use like a point source with a shoebox room, that means like a perfectly rectangular room of 2 types of sizes, so a small and a large room, which would be kind of typical size. And we use for that this point source with perfectly reflected walls. And we wanted to check what's the impact of the different layouts in the precision we can get in the multi-location measurement. So the idea of that is to put ourselves pretty much in the worst case scenario with perfectly reflective surface with a source that has no directivity whatsoever, and see how each reflection individually can be accurately captured and described. So the risk factor is basically accounting for errors in magnitude response, which would be associated with low variability. So you have some kind of double pain in the sense that the average you're looking at, which is likely to drive your EQ decision, is wrong, plus all the curves look very similar. So that means like it drives you in the direction of, yes, I want to EQ at part. But it shouldn't, because you have a wrong representation either of the variability or of the magnitude of the average magnitude response. So how do we calculate that? That's the only formula we're going to show in this presentation, but that's just to explain like how this criterion is derived, and we'll give you examples to try to recognize like how we can describe that. Okay, so a high risk factor would typically be that type of behavior with what we've captured with our average multi-location measurement is something that deviates quite largely from the ideal average that would be captured with 1,000 of microphones, which we can afford to do in simulations, but that we would never do in practice, associated with a very low variability. So here we can see we have this big error, and at the exact same frequency we have low variability, and that would be indicating a risk of taking a poor EQ decision. When we look at a lower risk factor, that might be such a deviation. But as we have like a quite high variability, we might not be tempted to go for an EQ decision there. And overall, what we want to keep in order to have one compact number and have an easier analysis is to take the worst case scenario of all. So that's what we would call this 95th percentile. So it's really the highest value, almost the highest value that we could get throughout the frequencies in order to capture like the worst case scenario and assess our configuration. So if we look, for example, and in order to get an idea of how these numbers could show up, like if we take this intersect line configuration with 6 locations, and we are looking actually at the floor notch. I think that's what we are looking at, right? The floor reflection, sorry. That's what we're looking at right now. We see that we have not such a good capture of the average response. So the red curve is quite different from the target black curve. Plus we have some areas of low variability, of lower or even very low variability, which are driving us into a criteria of a risk factor of 0.93, which is quite a high value in our simulation. Whereas if we go for a zebra layout with 8 locations, as we can see there, we see that the average is much closer to our target with these 8 locations. And we see as well that we have quite a good representativity of the variability of the response we might expect. So that means with this zebra configuration, we're already really close to something that would be equivalent to 1,000 microphones spread in this measurement area. And we can see that's reflected by the risk factor, which is much lower. So we see it's 0.42 in that case. So just to sum up, in terms of acoustic measurements, for better representativity of our data, what we want as an area is a source coverage. So it's to represent the source coverage, but to limit ourselves to 1/4 and 3/4 of the depth, remain away from the sidewalls, a layout that comprises multi-locations. We don't want to have a single line which would be equidistant to sidewall, because that could lead us into a dangerous situation where we would overlay, and that would be caused from this sidewall. So we want to favor location spread both in width and in depth of the coverage. And a minimum number, or pretty much like let's say an optimum number, seems to be 8 in this in our recommendation. And in general, there's a rule of thumb which we end up by recommending as well in our training. So in the loudspeaker system calibration training, is overall the less EQ the better, and we shouldn't use more than 1 EQ point per measurement location. So that means if we don't have enough location, we don't have enough information to be able to drive that EQ decision in a, let's say, deterministic manner. So we don't have enough information. The more locations we are going to have, the better we'll have the ability to put EQ that will be working and representative for the entire audience. Okay. So now let's move on to the next part, our second part, where we will want to see how we can optimize for measurement quality. Optimizing for measurement quality will be typically addressed by properly setting the different parameters for the record of M1, where typically we can choose the number of sweeps we'll be using, the sweep duration, and the sweep gain. And out of those three parameters that will drive actually the measurements or the captures we will get, that will be ultimately combined into one single measurement. So out of multi-sweeps, we combine them together to create one single measurement for each location on each system each group that's being measured. And this response is going to be used for EQ and for alignment in other tabs of the software. So we are going to address that for two frequency ranges. High frequencies first, so primarily above 1K, and low frequencies. And in that case, we'll focus more at much lower frequency, below 250, and most actually around the cutoff frequency of the loudspeaker system we're using or the subwoofer range. But let's start with high frequencies. So high frequencies will be largely affected actually by atmospheric conditions. And this is true particularly outdoors, but we'll see that there's some variation as well indoor that we need to be aware of. There are slow variations that are well known about temperature and humidity. So we know that this is relatively slow in time, and that's something that we can cope with as well with other tools in our ecosystem. So namely AutoClimate in Network Manager, where we can adjust for particular atmospheric conditions. But there will be also wind or in general air movements, which can be caused by HVAC as well indoors, that will induce some very fast variations of the conditions, and will end up in quite a large spread of responses at high frequencies. So this spread that we see on this figure at this higher frequency range would be obtained by repeating measurements. So in that case, that was outdoor in a relatively calm condition around 60 meters, 60, 80 meters. And by repeating measurements like 50 measurements, like we can see that we have many different frequency responses with a spread that can go up to, in this case, more than actually 15 dBs. So that means from one capture to the next, like you can have a completely different result at high frequency, and it can be difficult to use only one as a reference for an EQ. So it will be definitely having an high impact on your EQ decisions. So how are we going to capture that and to be able to capture a measurement that's representative of the conditions? Meaning this measurement we would capturing at a given time. And if we were to repeat it maybe 1 or 2 minutes later, we want to make sure we would have something that's as close as possible to that reference we use for EQ, such that what we've used for EQ is really stable over time. So for that, in M1, we could address that by varying the number of sweeps, the sweep duration, or the sweep level, the sweep gain. So first, let's look at how this spread is evolving with distance and frequency. And there we are primarily outdoors. And what we can see is that typically it will evolve quite linearly with, or let's say almost plus 2 dB for each octave. So the spread is being averaged there in the 1 kHz band, in the 2 kHz band, 4 kHz, 8 kHz. And we can see that it's almost plus 2 dB more or less in average for each band. And we have also an increase with the distance to a source. So our recommendation in the end is to avoid measurements at too large distances. So that means like when we were indoor, we were limiting to this 3/4 of the coverage area, but more generally outdoors where we want to cover over very large distances, we have to be aware that above 60 meters or such, like we won't be able to capture really qualitative data. So we need to rely rather on simulations to optimize the system performance at high frequencies, as we can do through our sound vision software. What's the influence of wind conditions? And that's quite interesting to look at. So we're lucky enough to be able to perform measurements at the same location with the same system, but with very different wind conditions. And what's interesting to see is that depending on the conditions, so if we take condition 1, day 1, at that time, it was right after rain actually, and the wind speed was completely negligible. And what we can see is that the spread is actually quite small. However, in condition 2, where the wind was much stronger, the spread is bigger, but the worst spread we get not only when the wind is high, but when it varies a lot. So that means like it's not only like the wind speed in general that's important, but it's also the variation of this wind speed and the variation of wind over space in general that will drive, that will create that big spread in high frequencies. So we'll look now into how M1 handles that. So in M1, we have the ability to capture a measurement as a combination of multiple sweeps, as we've been discussing. And that's an average in dB, typically. So we'll average like the responses, the frequency responses, the magnitude in dB. It's not a linear averaging where we would account for phase. It's really combining all these responses together. And this will give us typically multiple snapshots of atmospheric conditions that we can average together to get a response that's very representative of the behavior of the system. For that, we created a test scenario that I'll describe now and will be quite similar in the study for low frequencies, where we acquired series of 50 sweeps. So 50 consecutive sweeps with a very short interval in between them for 3 sweep duration. So the typical 3 sweeps duration we would consider in M1, which is M, quite a small sweep, 1 point something seconds. L, which is double length, and XL, which is the maximum length we can allow in M1. And then 3 levels, which are plus or minus 6 dB around a reference level. And the reference level is something we set by considering basically that we are driving the system at normal operating conditions. So that means setting the master gain at the typical level at which we would want to play during a show, and then setting the sweep gain inside M1 at minus 36 dBFS, which corresponds pretty much to normal operating conditions, considering the crest factor of the sweep. And then we would, in a post-processing step, look at measurements, which would be combinations of only 1, originally, sweep, or 2, 4, 8, or 12 consecutive sweeps. That means we take those sweeps together as they were acquired. So we had this series of 50. We take 4 of them that are consecutive, put them together as a measurement. So that means, for example, out of these 50 sweeps, if we want to group by 4, that means we can get 47 measurements, different measurements, because we consider only consecutive sweeps. And the same for higher number of counts. The influence of the number of sweeps, we can check what it does. The big win is actually that it will heavily reduce what we call measurement instability. So the measurement instability is the spread of measurements within 1.8 kilohertz octave bands. So it's averaging, it's taking all the values together within that frequency range and looking at how they perform. And we can see that this diamond there in the curve corresponds to the average instability among frequency. And we can see that looking outdoor and indoor, we get a fair reduction of the instability. So we start here outdoor for more than 10 dB of instability. And by increasing the number of sweeps, we can bring it down to something like 3 dB here. And even indoor, it's actually quite interesting to note that this instability is not null, because we have some air movement, we have typically air conditioning, and we would have a decrease also, which is quite beneficial to the stability of the measurements. So our recommendation is typically to use 8 sweeps outdoor, with the wrong figure, sorry, and 4 sweeps indoor, by swapping them. So 4 sweeps indoor was actually this model of the Accor Hotel Arena, where we did our measurements, and this is the outdoor view. What's interesting is to look at the effect of this combination of sweeps on the measurement distance. So the more instability, the more sweeps we get, the more we can bring down the instability. So we go from, and that's valid at all distances. So we see that at short distances, there is a dramatic reduction, but that's true also at high distances. However, starting from 60 meters, we see that especially outdoors, it's getting difficult to bring the instability down. And that's already using 8 sweeps, so we probably don't want to do much more than that. What's also interesting, and that's a bit to be considered, is that we don't get a benefit of increasing the sweep duration. Whatever being the duration, so if we use M, L, or XL, we see that the spread we get, or the instability, considering just one sweep, but the results are very similar with a different number of sweeps, are very similar. So they are almost undistinguishable. And why is that? It's because, I think, Scott, you wanted to ask a question?
Yeah, so at some point, like, and maybe this is the right time, maybe you'll tell me to say later, why is it that the sweep is giving us a better result than, say, doing an average of noise over time? Is that I think that's the right time to ask this question.
Exactly. So so that's the right time to ask this question, and the reason is actually that we sweep, we have to imagine that we play one frequency at a time. So that means that whatever being the length of the sweep, like we'll always play one frequency at a time. So we'll be able to sample one precise atmospheric condition. And the problem that we might have with white noise or pink noise at this step is that pink noise will play high frequency throughout the signal, throughout the playback and the recording of a test signal, and there will be some inherent averaging into it. The problem is that the averaging is not happening as we do in energy, but it's happening in amplitude. So you would sample many conditions and average them, and in the end possibly create comb filtering, because that's what's quite well known, is that typically that high frequency variability and behavior will result in different time of arrival of the higher frequency components. So you will have a typical comb filtering scenario where you would have a degraded response, and you will not benefit from this averaging of a snapshot of different conditions. Similarly, like the influence of the level, as we can see in the second figure, is very limited, if not null. what we see is that actually, as you can imagine, the effect of the wind is completely independent from the level at which we are playing the PA. So it's not necessary to play very loud to be able to capture a good response. And especially that effect of spread will be the same, whatever being the level at which we play.
So Etienne, is this why, like, when I measure a system with like pink noise or white noise, especially outside at distance, what I see in a measurement and what I hear don't seem to correspond much at all in the high frequency? Like, there's usually a pretty big variance at what I'm experiencing in my ears versus what I'm measuring with that several seconds of average. Is that what you're trying to explain here, that as we combine all these different signals, they create a comb filter as all the different little signals that arrive over that several seconds are canceling each other out a bit?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean. So, and that's because like you have this kind of inherent averaging in amplitude. So you're going to create comb filtering by averaging them. In our case, we don't have that because the average is done in energy. So we have an average in terms of energy and not like creating all this comb filtering. And that's beneficial to the equation.
Oh, cool. That's really interesting. Thank you, Etienne.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, let's move forward. And now we'll talk about low frequencies and how we can optimize measurement quality in that frequency range. So the noise effect on the measured response, as you know, will be very much affected by background noise. And that will again bring some instability of repeated measurements. So if we were to measure several times, we would have like quite a different result. And that's what we can see in this graph at this lower frequency. And that will typically create a measurement error compared to a reference response. So if we are lucky enough to have a response that tells us like what it should look like, and that's here the case, like we have this reference response in red that we have created. So I'll explain how and why later on. But what we can see is that especially around the cutoff frequency of the system, which is there, so that's in our case like 10 dB lower to the maximum response of the system, we see that around that cutoff frequency, there is a lot of variance in the frequency response that we're going to obtain. And this will have an impact on EQ if we were to EQ in that frequency range, and obviously on alignment, because alignment will check for summation typically of subwoofer, which we want to measure also in this range, and also the main system. And we might have like some issues to properly align our systems. So once again, like we've done a bit similar analysis where we have looked for measurement quality optimization in M1 by checking number of sweeps, sweep duration, and sweep level. So first, what we wanted to show is actually something I think that's really important, is when we talk about noise, what is noise? How does it show up? What spectrum, what variability? So we measured noise in two conditions: outdoor in our L-Acoustics facilities, and indoors in the same venue at Accor Hotels Arena. And what we saw is that overall, the noise indoor or outdoor, so outdoor being the black curve and indoor being the blue curve for the average, are quite similar in shape. So we have a -6 dB per octave shape, but there is a lot of variability that's associated to it. So that's about 12 dB indoor and more than 20 dB outdoor. So outdoor, what we're going to experience is a lot more variability in the frequency response of that noise, and that will create a lot more uncertainty in what we're going to capture. So in M1, we have the ability to estimate the signal to noise ratio, which is typically the ratio between the level or the energy we have in a snapshot of noise that we capture right before the sweep, and the level during the sweep. And if we look at this graph on the right side, what we see is that we have our reference curve there, which is associated to a fairly high SNR. So that's this blue curve, dashed curve here. The SNR is quite high and nice, and we have a clean curve. And then, like, we have this black curve, which is a noisy response, in which we have quite a bit of error, especially in these lower frequencies, which is associated with a very low SNR. So it gives us a bit of an indication of what's the quality of the measurement and the error we can expect. In M1, we have a different way of averaging responses at low frequencies. So instead of using actually energy averaging as we would do at high frequencies, we use amplitude averaging. And the benefit of that is that all the signal that's going to be used in the various snapshots or various sweeps will be able to sum up in a very consistent manner, whereas the noise, which is primarily different from one take from the other, will get relatively reduced over the signal. So by multiplying the number of measurements, we'll be able at low frequency to increase the signal to noise ratio, because we'll have more signal than noise, because noise relatively will go down. And this will drive us into quality improvement of our measurements. So what we did was typically to emulate that process with the same set of measurements that we had for the high frequency. Outdoors at L-Acoustics with 8K, indoors at Accor Hotels Arena with 12K1 and 4K2 down. Again, we're going to test for different sweep duration. And again, we're going to test for different sweep levels. So what we can see is that looking at the SNR, how the SNR is evolving typically when we multiply the number of sweeps. Again, like, we will create this kind of combination of measurements out of more or less sweeps. So it's the same kind of test scenario as we did in high frequency, and look at the average SNR or different values of SNR depending on actually the number of sweeps that we get, and also comparing what we have indoor and what we have outdoor. So first thing I want to explain, or let's say comment on, is the fact that we have a slight difference in SNR outdoor and indoor. And it's just because we had different systems and we had a different playback level. So we start with we have a starting point which is not exactly the same. However, what we observe, and which is the most important part, is that the average SNR we get in all the different measurements and across all the different frequencies around this cutoff frequency value is actually increasing, and as a tendency, we can see that it's increasing at about 2 dB per doubling the number of sweeps, and this is true for both for outdoor and indoor values. That's for average frequencies. Now, if we look at extreme frequencies, which would be those crosses, and an extreme value would be those values where the SNR is extremely low, so we'll typically generate a very high error in our measurements. We see that we get also an effect, which is, however, a bit smaller, so it's in the range of 1 dB per doubling the number of sweeps. And the effect is very similar for indoor and outdoor. What I want to show is basically what we are going to have if we look at the responses. So we have our target response, and now I can explain that actually this target response was obtained by using this combination of sweeps, but using actually the 50 sweeps that we had in our series of acquisition at a given condition. So there we are looking for a measurement for a sweep duration of M, we are looking at a lower level of reference level -6 dB. And we are looking at all the different acquisitions that we could get with one sweep. And what we can see is that we have this reference, which is the combination of all, which is very clean and very smooth. And all the other responses we get have a very large error. So we see they deviate quite largely from our reference, and they have quite a large instability. Now, if we go for 4 sweeps, we see that the error is going down quite significantly, as well as the instability. So we're going to have, if we repeat that measurement, so we combine 4 sweeps and we do it once and we do it a bit later in time, we're going to have already something that's much closer and much more stable over time, and much more representative as well of the response of the system. And now if we go for 8 sweeps, we see that we have reduction again. So error is going down, instability is going down. That means we're going to have even higher quality data. Okay, now when we look at what it does on the measurement error. So overall, because there I was showing like a particular case, and we were looking only at what was happening indoors. So let's look also at what it does outdoor. And we see that overall the measurement quality is improved. And we can see that for extreme values of errors, so that means those errors that would deviate the more from the reference response, we have a reduction of this level of these extreme values of error of about 2 dB per doubling the number of sweeps. And we also have some error for the higher values. Those higher values, the higher part here is representative of, let's say, more or less like kind of the, that's the 75th percentile, as we call it, which is pretty much representative of the higher values that you will get in general. And we see that there we get a reduction as well. And what's interesting is that it applies both indoors and outdoors, so we have an efficient process for in both cases. And overall, what we have to recognize is that the lower the error is overall lower indoors than outdoors, although we had a higher SNR outdoors than indoors. So it's kind of opposite. And that's something we can recognize here for the extreme values, but also for the higher values. And in general, that's 50% chance, that's the 50% data that we can recognize in all of these values. Now, let's look at the measurement instability. So how these measurements will be, let's say, consistent over time with the number of sweeps. What we can see is that the measurement instability is heavily reduced by increasing the number of sweeps. Overall, it's lower indoor than outdoor. Again, although the SNR was higher outdoor than indoor. And the explanation actually is quite simple, is that as we saw, like outdoor, there was a much higher variability of the noise level. So that means the noise will be very different from one take to the other. So even though on average, like the SNR was better, like there is such a variability that it will affect the response in a very different manner. And that helps us to derive actually our recommendation, which is fortunately, and that's quite good, consistent with what we had at high frequencies, is to use 4 sweeps indoor and 8 sweeps outdoor. And we see that with 4 sweeps indoor and 8 sweeps outdoor here, we get about the same type of values in terms of instability, meaning we'll have quite consistent data if we were to capture those responses at different times. Now let's look at the influence of the sweep duration. What's quite interesting to notice is actually that there is almost none. So in terms of measurement error. So we'll get about the same type of result in terms of measurement error, whether we use M, L, or XL. we are showing it here at a given level, which is reference -6 dB, but it will be about the same type of result at another level. And that's true for these extreme values of error, or for any other type of values where by groups of 3 there, you see that whether you use there L, L, or XL, you have very similar values, and that's true also here. And although there might be some differences, they are not always the case with a different number of sweeps, and there would be slightly, the order might be slightly different at different level. So that means, however, what's really interesting is that the error reduction we get by multiplying the number of sweeps, however, is very similar independently of the sweep duration. So that means we could stick to M and size M and have already something that works really good. What about the level? What we can see is, for example, when we look at indoor and we're using this sweep duration of M, it looks like we have quite some improvement by increasing the level. So the higher the level would correspond to a smaller level. So it's a reference level -6 dB. There, that's the reference level, and then that would be the reference level plus 6 dB. We see that on extreme values, as well as on average and higher values, we have about the same tendency that the error is going down. However, the problem is that the effect is a little bit inconsistent, meaning that outdoor, actually, we get almost no effect, no benefit of using +6 dB over reference level compared to -6 dB. And that's because the reference level was set to be a bit higher in volume, and there would be no benefit in going higher. So that shows pretty much the importance of setting the right reference level to start with. And then, like, the level itself will not bring a lot of benefit afterwards. And once again, it needs to be representative of the operating level of the system and use the sweep gain of -36 dBFS to be safe. So if we recap a little bit all of that, we end up with record settings in M1 that could be with a rather simple recommendation, where we would recommend to use multiple sweeps. So typically 8 sweeps outdoors. That's what will give us like the best representativity and quality of measurements, both at low and high frequencies. 4 sweeps indoors. Again, like that seems to be enough to get good quality data. The sweep duration has little influence. So let's say M is just fine. You might stick with M and rather multiply the number of sweeps rather than use a longer sweep and then like not do it for the same length of the recording process. And then sweep level should be representative of the operating level of the loudspeaker system. So that sweep gain at -36 dBFS and a master gain as planned to achieve the design objectives. So I hope like you could benefit from that presentation. If you want to know more, we've published, I think on the chat, like a link to download 3 white papers that we have done and that we have published these days, which are recapping pretty much what we've been presenting here. So one related to the measurement location, one related to the optimization at high frequencies, and one related to the optimization at low frequencies. Okay, and that's all I get from my side.
Etienne, thank you very much. Francois, thank you as well. Francois seems slightly preoccupied as he has a 4-week-old at home, so he is presenting a presentation here and I would say babysitting, but apparently it's not babysitting when it's your child. So thank you, Francois. Thank you, Etienne. There was a lot of amazing questions. I was trying to do my best to follow along with the Q&A, and I know that Samuel and Tommy and Sergey and Alex did a bunch of great answers. Etienne, the one I think that we can maybe just reiterate one more time because it's come up repeatedly is why pink noise versus a sweep. If you could just summarize that in your best 60-second answer, just the differences. How about that?
Okay, so let's try to be quick and honest with that. So I think there was one. So the first one is annoyance. I think that's something that we repeat is pink noise. Like repeating pink noise can be quite annoying and tiring, whereas a sweep is often considered as something like a bit bizarre but less intrusive. So that's one part. The second part, there are several like really objective ways, objective reasons. One is one that I was explaining, talking about, is this ability to take a snapshot for one frequency of atmospheric conditions. And that's quite powerful because we don't get disturbed by this kind of inherent averaging, which will actually disturb the frequency response that we obtain. There is a third one, which is about like the way we perform this dual FFT is the frequency response of a sweep is really nice. It's just a perfect slope. When we are to invert and get back and extract the frequency response of a system, we need to subtract what we've measured against like what the sweep would do typically. And when we have a very clean and clear frequency response, which the sweep gives us, it's very easy to subtract and to be less also preoccupied by the influence of typically noise that may pop up quite a lot when we have pink noise, because a pink noise can have very, very low level on its own at a given frequency. Okay. And then one last thing, which is also quite nice, is that with sweep, we have a way, quite an easy way, and that's something we explain shortly, but we talk about it in the loudspeaker system calibration training. We can extract also the linear part of the response quite easily. So if there are some small non-linearities in the system, we are quite gentle with them and we can extract them, because in the time domain, we will be able in the time domain to completely separate them from the linear part and keep only the linear part which interests us. So we are more gentle to higher level playback, which may introduce a bit of non-linearities or a bit of limitation, and that's quite beneficial as well.
Well, thank you very much, Etienne. This was a really cool presentation, and I hope everyone was able to grab some new knowledge and new information. I've put in the Q&A, if you haven't already downloaded it, 3 links for the white papers. So please go ahead and download those, and you can read those over the weekend. If going forward you guys have more questions about measurement quality and representativity, don't hesitate to reach out to your local L-Acoustics application engineer. And I hope Samuel, Tommy, Alex, and Sergey were able to help answer your guys' questions. Etienne, great job as usual. Francois, good job being dad / presenter /
Thank you.
Head of education. He's being a good father and keeping his child off the camera there, but it's a tough one. Thank you, Francois. And Guillaume, thank you for producing this event today. As always, you've done a great job. From L-Acoustics, wherever you guys are in the world, have a great weekend, and we'll see you on Monday. The schedule will be going live any minute now if it's not already. See you guys Monday, same time, same channel. Cheers, guys.